There is a version of you that learned to be very quiet. Not because you were naturally shy, not because you had nothing to say, but because you figured out early on that the house was safer when you disappeared into it. You learned to read the temperature of a room before you walked in. You learned what kind of mood meant dinner would be tense, what kind of silence meant someone was about to explode, what tone of voice meant you should make yourself small. And here's the thing that nobody told you. That was not childhood. That was a job. And by the end of this, you will understand why so many of the problems you are fighting as an adult are not character flaws at all, but survival strategies that simply outlived their usefulness. Let us start with the paradox at the center of all of this. Children do not get to choose their families. You did not apply for the household you were born into. You did not interview your parents, weigh the emotional climate, and decide this seemed like a healthy environment for your development. You arrived. And whatever was there, you adapted to it. That is not weakness. That is biology. That is what children are designed to do. The human brain, particularly in those first 10 to 12 years, is essentially a learning machine, absorbing patterns, building models of how the world works, and most importantly, building a model of how relationships work. What love looks like, what safety feels like, what you have to do to get your needs met. The psychologist John Bowlby, who spent decades studying how early relationships shape us, put it plainly when he said that intimate attachments to other human beings are the hub around which a person's life revolves. Not a feature of childhood, the hub, the center. And when that center is unstable, when the people you depended on most were unpredictable or cold or in conflict or simply absent in all the ways that matter, you did not just have a hard childhood. You built your entire inner world around that instability. The tragedy is not that unhappy families produce damaged children. The tragedy is that they produce extremely well-adapted children. Children who adapted to something they should never have had to adapt to. And the conventional wisdom around this tends to make things worse. We live in a culture that loves a clean narrative. You had a hard childhood, you go to therapy, you do the work, you heal, you move on. There is a before and an after. There is a wound and then a scar. People say things like, just set boundaries, or you need to forgive, or that was so long ago, as if the nervous system has a calendar, as if you can simply decide that the past is the past. The problem with this framing is that it locates the solution entirely in the conscious mind, in insight and willpower, and ignores the fact that most of what happened to you in those early years was absorbed below the level of language, below the level of explicit memory. You do not remember learning to be anxious in certain situations. You just are. So let us go deeper. Let us actually look at what happens inside a child who grows up in a home where unhappiness is the background noise of daily life. The first thing to understand is what psychologists call the attachment system. When you were young, your nervous system was essentially wired by your caregivers. Researchers Mary Ainsworth and later Mary Main spent years watching how children responded when separated from their parents and then reunited with them. What they found was that children fell into recognizable patterns. Some children had what is called a secure attachment, meaning when their parent left, they were upset. But when the parent returned, they were comforted and went back to playing. The world felt safe enough. But other children showed different patterns. Some clung desperately and could not be reassured even when the parent came back. Some seemed almost indifferent, as if they had already learned that reaching out did not help. And some showed a deeply painful pattern called disorganized attachment, where the parent was simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of fear. These children had no coherent strategy, because there was no coherent strategy available to them. Now here is why this matters for adults. Research by psychologist Philip Shaver and others found that these early attachment patterns do not stay in childhood. They travel with you. They show up in your friendships, your romantic relationships, your relationship with yourself. The person who learned that love comes with unpredictability tends to feel most at home in relationships with a certain amount of drama or uncertainty. Not because they like suffering, because the nervous system finds familiarity more comfortable than peace. Peace actually feels wrong at first. Peace feels like something is about to go wrong. Then there is what psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, author of the landmark work The Body Keeps the Score, spent his career documenting. Trauma does not live only in memory. It lives in the body, in the way you tighten when someone raises their voice, in the way your stomach drops when you sense conflict coming, in the way certain tones of voice can take you from a fully functioning adult to a frightened 10-year-old in less than 3 seconds. The technical term for this is a somatic response, which just means the body is responding to a present threat based on the blueprint of a past one. Your body learned something, and it is very loyal to what it learned. There is a third layer here, and it is perhaps the most insidious. Researchers studying what is called the self-concept, how we understand ourselves, found that children who grow up in chaotic or emotionally neglectful homes often develop what psychologist Carl Rogers called conditions of worth. This is the idea that you are lovable only when you are performing correctly, only when you are not causing problems, only when you are achieving or being helpful or staying invisible. You do not get love as a given. You earn it. And the long shadow of that is an adult who is deeply uncomfortable simply existing, who must always be useful, always be productive, always be fine. Stillness feels dangerous. Rest feels irresponsible. Because somewhere in the wiring of your early years, rest meant you were no longer earning your place. Sit with that for a moment. Because I think for a lot of people watching this, that hit somewhere familiar. Now I want to give you a reframe, not a solution, because I want to be honest with you. There are no quick solutions here, but a different way of understanding what happened to you that is more true. And because it is more true, it is also more useful. The philosopher and psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, writing in the 1950s in his book, The Art of Loving, made a distinction that I have thought about for years. He said there is a difference between immature love, which follows the principle, I love you because I need you, and mature love, which says, I need you because I love you. Most of us, if we are honest, grew up in families where the emotional logic was closer to the first than the second. Not because our parents were monsters, but because they were also children once, raised in their own unhappy homes, carrying their own unexamined wounds, doing the best they could with what they had. The transmission of emotional dysfunction across generations is not about bad people. It is about unexamined patterns moving forward in time because no one stopped to look at them. Carl Jung said it more sharply. He wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. Read that again. The unlived life of the parent. The dreams your father gave up and never processed. The grief your mother carried and never spoke about. The resentments that had nothing to do with you, but filled the air of your house anyway. Children are extraordinarily permeable. You absorbed all of it, not because you were weak, because that is what children do. And Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who founded logotherapy, offered something I find genuinely moving here. He wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. In that space lies our growth and our freedom. Now, what is heartbreaking and also hopeful about this is that for many people who grew up in unhappy families, that space, that pause between what happens and how you react, was never developed because there was no time. You had to react immediately. Hypervigilance was survival. The hair-trigger nervous system that made you such an effective child in a difficult household is the same nervous system that makes adult life feel exhausting. But here is the reframe I want to offer. That space, the one Frankl describes, is not gone. It was not developed. And anything that was not developed can be developed. The brain retains something called neuroplasticity long into adulthood, which simply means it can change. Not quickly, not without effort. But the wiring is not fixed. The patterns you absorbed are not your personality. They are your history. And history, unlike destiny, does not determine what comes next. The Stoics, particularly Epictetus, a man who was born a slave and became one of the most respected philosophers of his time, taught something remarkably aligned with modern neuroscience. He said that people are disturbed not by events, but by their judgments about events. What he was pointing to was exactly this gap between stimulus and response. The event happened. The interpretation of the event, and especially the conclusion you drew about yourself from the event, that is where the suffering lives. The child who was neglected did not just experience absence. They concluded something from that absence. I must not be worth staying for. I must not be lovable enough. I must have done something wrong. Those conclusions felt true at the time because a child's mind does not have the cognitive sophistication to say, my parent is struggling with their own unresolved trauma. The child makes it about themselves, because making it about themselves at least gives them the illusion of control. If it is my fault, maybe I can fix it. And that right there is the mechanism. That is the engine running underneath so much adult anxiety, perfectionism, people-pleasing, emotional avoidance. Not weakness, not damage. A child's best attempt at logic in an illogical situation. So what do you do with this? Knowing something intellectually is genuinely different from living it, and I want to be careful not to hand you a list and make you feel like you are 3 steps away from being fixed. You are not broken. There is nothing to fix. But there might be things worth looking at honestly. The first invitation I want to offer is this. Begin to notice, not judge, but notice when your reaction feels disproportionate to what is actually happening. You snap at a friend for a mild inconvenience. You feel a wave of anxiety before a conversation that is actually fine. You go completely numb in a moment that deserves feeling. These are not character flaws. These are signals. The nervous system reaching for an old pattern. When you notice this happening, you do not need to immediately understand it. Just naming it to yourself. This is bigger than the situation warrants, creates a tiny amount of that Frankel space. That gap, that is not nothing. That is actually the beginning of everything. The second invitation is harder, and I will be honest that this is something I have sat with myself. It involves revisiting the story you tell about your childhood. Not to assign blame, not to go back and rewrite history, but to look at it with slightly more adult eyes. Most people who grew up in difficult families carry one of 2 stories. Either, my childhood was fine, I turned out okay. Other people had it worse. Which is a way of bypassing something that still needs attention. Or my family was terrible, and that is why I am the way I am. Which can become a prison of its own. Neither of those stories is fully true. The more honest story is usually something like, real pain happened, real harm was done, and also the people who did it were themselves incomplete people doing their best with what they had, and also, I have more agency now than I did then. That is a complicated story. It does not fit on a bumper sticker. But complicated stories are almost always truer than simple ones. The third invitation is the one that I think is most underrated, and it is simply this: let yourself want what you actually want. One of the quieter consequences of growing up in a home where your emotional needs were not well met is that many people stop knowing what they want. Not the big existential wants, but the small daily ones. Do you actually like that food? Or did you just learn to eat what was given to you without complaint? Do you actually enjoy that job? Or is it just the one where you could perform well enough to feel safe? Do you actually want to be in that relationship? Or does its chaos feel like home because home always felt like chaos? These are not comfortable questions, but they are honest ones. The psychologist Mary Ainsworth, whose attachment research I mentioned earlier, found something in her data that has always stayed with me. The single most predictive factor for whether a child developed secure attachment was not whether the parent was perfect. It was whether the parent was able to repair the ruptures. Every parent, even good ones, gets it wrong sometimes. The question was whether they came back, whether they acknowledged what happened, whether the child learned that disconnection was not permanent, that relationships could break and be repaired. I think about that a lot in the context of adult life, because many of us are still waiting for that repair that never came. And part of growing up, in the psychological sense, is coming to terms with the fact that it may not come. The parent may not apologize, the acknowledgement may never arrive, and the work becomes learning to repair the relationship not with them, but with yourself, to become the secure base that you needed and did not get. The philosopher Alain de Botton, writing about childhood and therapy, said something I find both devastating and liberating. He wrote that the goal of therapy is not to make you happy. It is to acquaint you with the specific nature of your unhappiness so that you can stop blaming yourself for things that were not your fault and start taking responsibility for the things that are. That distinction matters enormously. Stopping the blame does not mean pretending nothing happened. It means understanding the origin clearly enough that you can stop visiting the charges onto yourself. Because that is ultimately what so many children from difficult families do. They internalize the chaos. They decide the problem was them. And they spend decades trying to fix a self that was never the problem. You were not the problem. Let me say that directly. The child who learned to be quiet, or helpful, or invisible, or high-achieving, or agreeable to the point of self-erasure was not a broken child. That was a child trying very hard to survive in a situation that asked too much of them. The strategies made sense then. They are just no longer necessary now, and that is the shift worth moving toward. Not healing as a destination, not some imagined future where you have finally dealt with all of it and arrived at peace, but healing as a direction. A gradual, non-linear, sometimes backsliding direction toward being able to feel more fully, want more honestly, connect more genuinely, and rest without guilt. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote in his Letters to a Young Poet a line that I keep returning to. I would like to beg you, dear sir, as well as I can, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and to try to love the questions themselves. That is it. That is the whole thing, really. Not to have the answers, not to be finished, but to become someone who can hold the questions without being destroyed by them. Because you made it here. You are watching this video. You are thinking about your own inner life. You are asking questions that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. That is not nothing. That is actually the hardest part. Most people never start. This topic connects to something much larger, which is the question of how we understand the self we inherited versus the self we can consciously build. That is the kind of conversation this channel exists for. If you want more of it, subscribing means you will not miss the next one, and I am genuinely curious about this. What is one story you have been telling yourself about your childhood that you are starting to suspect might not be the whole truth? Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. Not because I have the answer, but because sometimes saying it out loud is the beginning of something.